Warm greetings from the OSC headquarters and welcome back to this new episode of The Third Way Live with the SG. As many of you will be aware by now, our space to discuss more directly than we usually can. That is, me sharing some thoughts, some updates regarding the OSC, our work, but above all, about the vision for which we sacrifice, the vision for which we fight specifically, and of course, most importantly, in terms of the horizon to which we are walking together. And of course, after those thoughts, I usually open the floor to your questions, your comments, without filters. And today, perhaps, I would like to think back about when we started these live streams. Because over the past few weeks, my team here present, and here we have, for those of you who don't know, we have here Pearl, Betty, Fabian, Hidayat, Kulsi, Annabelle, Idrisi. And over the past few weeks, they have been giving me very true advice, very relevant advice with regards to those live streams, in order to make them more polished, in order to make them more effective. And over the past few days, I have been thinking about the purpose of those live streams. That is, I went back to the first days where I took the decision to start having those live sessions. And I recall, of course, there were many reasons for it. One of the principal reasons is, of course, when it comes to multilateral organizations, as I've said before, no matter how important our work, no matter how urgent our endeavors, we suffer as multilateral organizations, and the OSC is no exception, from seeming a bit too far from people's concerns, people's realities. And that is because that is true multilateralism is at the level, generally, of intergovernmentality. We do not directly address, usually, our peoples in respective countries. And even if we wanted to, we could not. And therefore, this was a space that I thought could be a space of democratization. Democratizing the OSC by explaining it better. But a democratization is always a two-way process. That is, yes, the platforms, the institutions, but also the participation. And therefore a space enabling any of our citizens, our youth, to partake in a conversation. That was the principal reason. But also, because I know that we have been communicating at times about these live stream sessions. And we often say that you can ask the SG any question without filters, without intermediaries. And that is true. But that is precisely what I wanted initially with the live streams. That is, to provide a more informal space. Not a very well-polished one, not one that is picture perfect and ready for clipping into an Instagram reel. No, it was a space where I could speak more bluntly and more informally, and sometimes even digress in my conversation and as I speak usually. And of course, to have that as well from you. Now, the problem is that, as you know, the live streams happen more often than not on a weekly basis. The risk, ultimately, is that it becomes a platform for me to have long monologues. But the live streams were not meant to be lectures. They were meant to be an exchange. And of course, with the frequency of those live streams, there's also the risk, always, of ending up with repetitive points, because one has to explain in case that not all the viewers are able to watch all of the sessions. And therefore, for this season, as our team termed it, that is season 2 of the Third Way Live with the SG, we took I wanted, ultimately, to play around with the Third Way Live with the SG. And when I say play around, that is continue to share my views as regularly as possible, but also to start inviting guests, to have conversations and exchanges. But the main challenge, of course, that we faced with regards to this is, they're live. And it's very difficult to get guests coming from across our greater south to Addis Ababa, or when I'm traveling, to make sure that they are available on a Sunday at the time that is convenient for most of our peoples. That is around 4:30 p.m. East Africa time. Because also, when we are in Brazil, for instance, and we are going to Brazil because of the COP, and also a conference on reparations in the upcoming weeks. But the main challenge, of course, is when you are in Brazil, 4:30 East Africa time is, around 7 a.m. perhaps? Something along those lines, 7, 8, maybe even earlier. And to make sure that those individuals are available at that specific time on a Sunday. And that's why we weren't able to play around with the guests. Play around, don't have bad second thoughts. I mean, inviting and play around with what the Third Way Live with the SG was meant to be. Conversations with you, but also hearing voices and perspectives across our countries. And my worry has been, and since, of course, this advice that I've been receiving from our PACE team, our Public Advocacy, Communication and Engagement team, which is, again, very good advice, mind you. That is, if I am going to be the only one speaking, it needs to be more polished. We need to start saying also certain sentences that can be clipped and posted on an Instagram reel. Because otherwise, we cannot communicate. And here I think it's a very symptomatic reality of the world today. I think that we've seen a shift, especially in the era of social media, but it started well before, that is, from the moment TVs started to appear, where the art of transmitting transmitting an idea, transmitting a cause, transmitting a vision, has been supplanted largely by the skill of communicating and posting well. And of course, both are necessary. But sometimes you run into the challenge, and I think we've seen this a lot, where public figures at all levels start thinking in communication terms. That is, rather than articulating the idea, articulating the principle, saying what they want to say, they end up thinking, okay, what can I say that will fit within an Instagram reel or within a tweet or within a quote card? That is, rather than saying what you believe and then finding the slogan for it, the skill of communicating, because it is an important one, it is a crucial one, and we need to get better at it at the OSC. It's thinking of the slogan first before thinking of the idea. And I do not want to fall into that trap, because that, mind you, is not the advice of my team. Because I need to defend their honor. That is not their advice. But the worry is, you always take one more step to polish it, one more step to think through that live stream session, and eventually, before you realize it, you formatted it, and formatted the way you think. And that is far off from the initial reasons of the live streams. So I want to play with another idea. And this is something I haven't actually discussed with the team, but I will discuss it with you. And of course, if you disagree, please do drop a comment and let me know. The main aspect, drop a comment, a turn of phrase that is so cliched nowadays. But anyway, you can leave a comment, tell me what you think about it, or even, who knows, send us an email about it. That would be refreshing. But the main part is that what I would like to do is change up the third way live with ESG. And that is, because of the reasons I expounded on why we couldn't get guests, make those live stream sessions, which I want to keep it because I want to be able to answer you live. I want you to know that when I am answering you without filters, and I had no time to prepare the answer or filter the questions I do not like. But I would like to do them less often. And I would like to do them less often, not because I am tired of them, far from it, but by doing them less often. First, I might have more things to share and it will become less repetitive. But most importantly, it will open up time for me in my travels, in my engagements, to identify and exchange, have dialogues with individuals, have them recorded and shared with you. And when I say inviting guests, people with whom I can talk and engage, that is, I am not a journalist. It will not be me interviewing those individuals, but engaging with them, sometimes agreeing, sometimes disagreeing, and more often than not, listening to what they have to say. I mean eminent intellectuals of our greater self. I mean activists. I mean, perhaps, who knows, some government officials in the context of an OSC General Assembly, but also the protagonists of the transformation, our coffee farmers, or a particular community leader within a particular region. And in this regard, I still don't have a name for it. The working name I have, which of course we will let you know once we have finalized it, but again, feel free to share your opinions, is to keep it in line in the same process. That is, we will keep the third way live with the SG, perhaps every 3 to 4 weeks. And then, in between, we will have the third way, maybe conversations with the SG. That is the working name. I'm still not quite pleased with it. So this is my announcement regarding these live streams. And I hope that you will all both agree with the idea, but once we implement it, also see value in it. That it may not only be me pontificating on a weekly basis, but also hearing the voices of our greater self, that compose our greater self, and that ultimately must build the third way of development from the greater self. Now, speaking of conversations, earlier this week, because I think it is time for me not to lecture, but also to give some updates regarding the OSC, I had wonderful conversations with two brilliant women. The first was Ambassador Atala Shabazz, the daughter of Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz, or better known as Malcolm X. And the other was with Mireille Fanon, for those of you who can guess by now, the daughter of Frantz Fanon. But of course, the conversations were fascinating. And of course, I am not one to kiss and tell. That is, I keep generally my private conversations private. So I will not enter into detail about what we discussed. But I say they were fascinating conversations because both of those individuals are more than just the daughters of their fathers. They are leaders, thinkers, activists in their own right. But you might ask, why am I mentioning this if I'm not going to kiss and tell? Well, I am, and again, I don't want misunderstanding. I will not share the conversation because it was a private conversation, or at least a bilateral conversation. But the reason that I am mentioning this to you is to announce an initiative of the OSC that we've been working on for some time now. And it was very important for us to have the buy-in, the confirmation, the consent, and the participation of Ambassador Atallah Shabazz and of Mary Fanu. And that initiative is a series of webinars that will start in December, perhaps a bit earlier if we're able to find the right dates that work for everyone. A series of webinars that will run into 2026 and culminate with a conference on a very important topic in my mind. And I say a very important topic. And that topic is, and of course I discovered this earlier this year, and as soon as I discovered the piece of information, I insisted that we had to do something about it. Because 2025 is a particular year for our greater self. Of course, as you always know, and I know I'm digressing, you're getting impatient to know what the initiative is, but of course we have a saying in Arabic, "Man sabara dhafara," whoever is patient will find success. And in this, some say it's a saying of the Prophet. And in any case, the main aspect is that 2025 is an important year for our greater self. And it is an important year because, yes, we are forward-looking. We are an organization. We as peoples are not stuck in the past, are not stuck in the present and omnibulated by it. We are looking towards the future that we want to build, the future that our peoples deserve, the future that can return a dignity that has been stripped, a humanity that has been forgotten to all of the world. That is, we want to build a third way of development. But there can be no construction without memory. And also, I would argue that what we are proposing is fundamentally transformative. And one could argue that if transformation is opposed to reform insofar as transformation goes to the root causes, since transformation changes underlying dynamics as opposed to reform, that is cosmetic alteration of the system as it is, then one could argue at the risk of being misquoted or misinterpreted, or perhaps even called a Che wannabe. It is, and I say it in the noblest possible sense, a revolutionary endeavor. And the thing is, with revolutions, is I think you cannot be a good revolutionary if you don't have a sort of melancholy, a certain sort of nostalgia. That is, you have to have le mal du siècle. Le mal du siècle from French poetry, which means the pain in the century. That is, feeling yourself out of place in the world as it is, which pushes you to want to transform it. And, of course, that means forward-looking, but that it also means finding comfort in the past, finding inspiration and strength in the past. And therefore, 2025 is an important year in that spirit, because it is 100 years since three extraordinary figures of our greater self were born. Of course, Malcolm X, Malik Shabazz. I say Malik Shabazz because Ambassador Atallah Shabazz did correct me during our conversation when I said Malcolm X. And she told me he has a name, and his name is Shabazz. Malcolm X, Malik Shabazz, Frantz Fanon, and Patrice Lumumba. Three figures of our greater self, all born in 1925. And all, terribly so also, finding their struggles cut short by dying far too young. And therefore, I thought it was important to acknowledge this extraordinary coincidence of history, of these three figures born in 1925, fighting for our greater self, fighting for decolonization. And when I say greater self, because some might say, yes, but Malcolm X, Malik Shabazz was in the United States. Yes, he was in the United States, but that is not contradictory. As I've always said, greater South, as opposed to global South, is a term that includes the South in the North. And there is no doubt that the civil rights movement in the United States was fundamentally a movement of the greater South. And of course, these three figures from three regions, right? That is Frantz Fanon, Martinique, that is the Caribbean, Patrice Lumumba in Africa, and of course, Malcolm X, Malik Shabazz in the United States, but all united in a certain sense, even though they did not all meet, united in a shared conviction, in a shared determination to transform the world, to build a world with greater justice. And therefore, from the OSC, we were determined that we needed to do something around this. And of course, we have reached that conclusion of creating a series of webinars to explore those great figures and the dialogue amongst them, and culminated with a conference in person with the families coming together as well as scholars and activists and even, who knows, political figures, and culminate on a book about those three extraordinary figures of the greater South. And that is why we were engaging well, I was engaging with the Fanon and Shabazz families. We are still trying to engage with the Lumumba family as well. But an important aspect is this endeavor, and this is something that I was conveying, and we talked about it actually with both of them, and because they raised it even before I had the opportunity to do so. This endeavor is not just one that seeks to celebrate and pay tribute to those figures. That would be stagnating them in the past. Of course, there will be a dimension of paying tribute and celebrating their life, legacies, and contributions. But the most important part, and this is why I said there is always a bit of nostalgia, finding inspiration from the past. It is reading those figures, understanding those figures, interpreting those figures and their struggles and their thinking in 2025 and 2026, in the 21st century. What does it mean to interpret our greater South and our world through the eyes of Frantz Fanon and his thought today? The same with Malcolm X, Malik Shabazz, and the same, of course, with Patrice Lumumba. And to do so in a manner that articulates through this book and through those engagements a foundation upon which we can project ourselves towards the future. And I say this because I think this is very important. Because I think that when you look at Malcolm X, you look at Patrice Lumumba, and you look at Frantz Fanon, what you ultimately see is there has been, well, that they are first and foremost radicals. But I say radicals not in the sense of extremists. I say radicals, that is, etymologically, those that go to the root of the problem, that were promoting a complete shift away, a break with the system as it was, to build a better future, to build a better system. Yet, ironically, just as it happened with Martin Luther King in the United States, just as it happened with other historic figures, the great irony of history is that the systems ended up normalizing them, adopting them, celebrating them. And the best way to neutralize a revolutionary is, of course, first, to defeat them irreversibly. Second, to find a way somehow to silence them so that they're never heard, never seen, and therefore cannot mobilize. But the third, and I think the most effective of all, is to honor them. And by honoring them, you have neutralized them, you have normalized them within the very system that they sought to completely transform and change. And that is not the spirit of this series. This series is truly, that is, the series of webinars that will culminate with a conference and provide a platform, is not in that spirit. It's not only to normalize and celebrate those intellectual figures, but find vitality and strength in their thought, examples, and struggles in light of our contemporary world. And within that, of course, the department that is in charge of implementing this initiative is a new department. Because, as I've always said, updates about the OSC as well. And it's a new department that stems out of the merger of two previous departments. That is, we merged the Department of Systemic and Endogenous Educational Development and SEED, and the Department of Research, Evaluation and Foresight, REEF, into a single department called the Department of SEER. As for those who don't know, I am a fan of acronyms that actually carry meaning. And SEER stands for Systemic Education and Endogenous Research. And the reason for this merger, and I'm mentioning it because you might say, well, these are the intimacies of the Secretariat, it might not be relevant to most people. But there is something more substantive than just an administrative consolidation. And the reason for that merger, well, the reasons in plural for that merger is, first, to consolidate all education and research functions in a single department to ensure greater coherence. That is, a single department is now in charge from early childhood education and care and education, to higher education and research. And you might say, well, why consolidating them in a single place? Because, as you know, our vision of balanced and inclusive education is a vision that promotes a systemic understanding of development, a systemic understanding of education, that is understanding that you cannot speak of education without speaking of technology. You cannot speak of technology policy without speaking of agriculture, and so on and so forth, that all the sectors interact. And that is true within sectors as well. And ultimately, it seemed important to enhance the coherence of our work across education, because REEF used to be in charge of higher education and research, and SEED used to be in charge of early childhood, primary, secondary, and TVET. But ultimately, whatever you want to do at the primary and secondary education level will have an impact on higher education. And whatever you do at higher education will have an impact on terms of primary and secondary education, by preparing your teachers, by exploring educational studies, and so on and so forth. So if you do not transform one, you cannot possibly expect good results from the policies of transformation that you implement in the other. And therefore, it seemed important to have a consolidated department with specialized, of course, sections, but a single team that could work and ensure the coherence of our endeavors, of our support to member states, from start to finish, so to speak. But the second reason is that the aim was, because those two departments had areas that overlapped naturally because of that systemic approach of education, was to ensure they collaborated quite extensively, naturally, but was to ensure greater collaboration. And I say this, and you might say again, this is the intimacy of the Secretariat. Why mention it? Why is it of interest? Because I think there is a more fundamental point there. And the more fundamental point is, I think that we suffer today from that polydisciplinary, multidisciplinary approach of education that has formatted the way we think. And in many respects, what this translates into, in many of our institutions, is sectoral segregations. Sectoral segregations that make it, no matter how much you try to have departments and sectors collaborate, there is always frictions. Walls, barriers that are artificial, that are being built. And of course, you need departments because you need to structure teams. But you cannot possibly have departments and teams, as we've seen in many multilateral organizations, that exist as parallel entities that do not communicate, and when they do communicate, are more in a dynamic of rivalries. Now, I say this, mind you, that was not the case between Seed and Reef. I think we successfully built at the OSC a collaborative spirit. But ultimately, a collaborative spirit is not enough. So we took a step at the Secretariat of the OSC, an unprecedented step, I might say, in terms of multilateral organizations, when we articulated our first common program for the 2023-2024 biennium. We did it not by department. We articulated the program based upon areas, focus areas, and projects. And in most, not all, of those projects, their implementation required more than one department. For example, the Greater South Information System, GRESIS, which I've already elaborated on, so I will not elaborate here, required both the Research Evaluation and Foresight department in terms of the content, the academic articles, and so on and so forth, but also our tied department, that is technology department, in terms of developing that open source platform. Because I do believe that you cannot abandon institutional collaboration to the goodwill of individuals. You have to institutionalize that collaboration. And of course, what emerged is ultimately, for the SIER merger, I mean the Seed and Reef merger that led to SIER, what I ultimately saw after the first 2.5 years of our activity is because of the overlap, even though we had institutionalized the collaborative spirit by creating projects that could not possibly be implemented by a single department. And, of course, despite the fact that we have generated a collaborative spirit and culture amongst our departments, what we ultimately saw, I think, is the overlap was so profound that there was sometimes inefficiencies in the program implementation. But to go back to my main point, now I've explained the new department of SIER, but to go back to my main point, which is why I raised this SIER issue and this institutionalizing of collaboration instead of rivalries. This, what I just mentioned, happens within organizations, but it also happens at the level of governments, and it certainly happens between organizations and governments. What do I mean? I mean that often we have seen within our endeavors for development throughout the decades that ministries of education tend to work in silos, whereas Ministry of the Economy works in another silo. I have seen countries where, for instance, the education system was pulling the country in a good direction, but the Ministry of Economy was pulling the country in a completely opposite direction because there was no collaboration. And of course, we all understand in the abstract that we need to collaborate. The question is, how do you ensure that that collaboration occurs? And that is by institutionalizing, by creating the mechanisms. And at the level of our countries, but it is up to each country, of course, I do believe we need, on the one hand, governance systems that are designed to be systemic with the relevant digital tools. This is why we're proposing from the OSC, and we want to collaborate with a number of other intergovernmental organizations in this regard. The Greater South Governance Optimization Vector, GRESGov, to facilitate that governance. Because ultimately, we need to start understanding the relations between our policies and not just understanding each policy. But that is at the level of government. Then at the level of each country, but at the level of governments collectively, you also see that. No? That is, we are in the same region, or we share the same interest, yet we are pulling in different directions. That ultimately weakens our endeavors. What do you need there? You need an intergovernmental organization with an executive secretariat to be able to facilitate that coordination amongst our governments to achieve common objectives. In this case, the OSC. The last one is, of course, this happening between organizations. And this is why I raised it. Because I think it was last week, but my team will correct me if I'm wrong, that we were mentioning the club and the Compromiso de Sevilla. Or it was the week before that. No harm done in getting the date wrong. The main point is that, and I mentioned that we were disappointed, in a certain sense, that there had not been greater coordination with the OSC. But what I'd like to raise today, and this is something that I have mentioned in my recent publication, for those of you that do not know, A Letter from the Greater South, Notes on Its Global Disorder, or for those of you who prefer the original Spanish, Una Carta Meridional, Apuntes del Claro Juro Mundial. And in this book, and this stems out of what I was saying, I do mention that South-South cooperation, as I've said before, repeatedly, and regional or continental integration mutually reinforce each other. A stronger, more integrated Arab world is a stronger Greater South. A more integrated Africa is a stronger Greater South. And a stronger Greater South, greater, more intensified South-South cooperation also facilitates and intensifies regional integrations. Because all that makes sense at South-South cooperation, all the reasons that make it so necessary are intensified regionally. But that since that is our premise, mutually reinforcing South-South cooperation and regional integrations in plural, well, we must ensure that our regional organizations, our continental organizations, no longer act as, how shall I say it, as isolated islands. As I've said before, we need them to act as an archipelago. But for this to occur, that is greater collaboration, greater interoperability between our organizations, greater coordination amongst our regional organizations also requires the instruments. Because if we leave it to the goodwill or how well two heads of two intergovernmental organizations get along, well, the day that they don't, on a personal basis, and God knows that this happens, well, the collaboration between those entities does not occur, which makes all of our endeavors all the more challenging. And I say this because we need to create and institutionalize at least an annual meeting between the heads of those respective organizations to coordinate, to identify common action points, to avoid duplication of efforts, to mobilize and pull resources together. And this does not need to be a heavy structure. It is an annual meeting, and then you institutionalize, you institute every quarter virtual meetings between identified technical teams of those organizations to share information, to identify common areas of collaboration, to identify means to mobilize resources together. And this is something that I had initially proposed, but you will recall that last week I did say that the worst crime in politics is not the crime of being wrong. The worst crime in politics is to be right at the wrong time. Or even worse now, to be, and that is the worst of all, to be right at the right time, but to not act quickly enough so that by then it's the wrong time again. I'll come back to this thought in a moment. But in any case, I had proposed it, I think, at the time, at the right time, the right idea at the right time. But of course, we were not able to implement it. In early 2020, as you know, the OSC was created, and I was elected to serve as the first Secretary General. But initially, I was Secretary General elect, because our charter had not entered into force. And according to Article 14, my only task was to establish a preparatory committee, preside it, and prepare for the entry into force of our collective organization. That is, I had no executive capacity at the time. But shortly thereafter, as many of you will recall, well, not many of you will recall, I hope that all of you recall it, because otherwise it would be quite worrisome. COVID happened. And the world paralyzed. And of course, one of the greatest challenges of COVID after health, but I mean equally, but I mean less obvious, but that was at everybody's, under everybody's consideration, was education. Because overnight, billions actually, of students could no longer go to school. And if you recall back then, the virtual meetings and Zooms and teaching remotely was not that well known. And of course, with millions of students not going back to school, the great worry was not only that they'll miss school for a few months, that many of them would not return, or those that did return would have already lost a gap in terms of their studies that would make it very difficult for them to catch up in terms of their own educational development. And of course, naturally, many intergovernmental organizations dedicated to education raised the alarm. And yet, what occurred? Very early on, each one of our intergovernmental organizations dedicated to education launched their own coalition to fight COVID. Coalition to mobilize resources, to direct those resources where it is most needed, and to ensure educational continuity. And now, of course, they were doing exactly what they should have done, save one aspect which they couldn't have done because the instrument was not there. And that was, rather than doing 5, 6, 7 coalitions for education and educational continuity, we should have created a single coalition of all intergovernmental organizations with education as part of their mandate to deliver to address the emergency. But that did not happen. And therefore, at the time, I thought, well, we need an instrument to be able to do this. And therefore, I proposed, at the time, establishing, once the OSC Charter would enter into force, and once the program was approved, if approved by the member states, an initiative that I called TPED. That is the Trans-Regional Partnership for Education and Development, TPED. And I started calling because at the time, as you know, before that I was president of ERF, Education Relief Foundation, and I had good relations with many of the heads of those organizations. I ended up calling the OAE, the Organization of Ibero-American States for Education, Culture and Science. I ended up calling ALEXO, which is the Arab League's version of UNESCO. I ended up calling ICESCO, which is the Islamic world's endeavor. Their DGs, the respective director generals, and in the case of OEI, the secretary general. And I ended up calling as well CIMEO, the Southeast Asian Ministers of Education organization, which was led by a brilliant woman at the time, who's no longer no longer the director of the Secretariat after finishing her term. But in any case, I called all of them, and I proposed this idea to them. And all of them, without exception, expressed their willingness and readiness to form this. That is, precisely what I was saying at the level of our continental and regional organizations, to create an annual meeting of the heads of those organizations, to share information, to avoid duplication of efforts, and to strengthen and to pull resources together when necessary, with quarterly technical meetings. Now, of course, I wasn't able, and I offered the OSC as a permanent coordination office at no cost for those organizations. Why? And establishing within the OSC a permanent coordination office, a small one, but one to ensure coordination. And then I also propose that the chairpersonship of that TPED, that partnership, be rotating amongst the organizations on an annual basis and on the basis of needs. That is, the OSCE would only be facilitating the coordination because the OSCE was the only intergovernmental organization of the South that shared member states with each of those organizations. In any case, unfortunately that we were not able to implement it at the time, and when we were finally able to implement it, that is 2023, because the Charter entered into force, we established the Secretariat, well, it was no longer COVID, so many of them lost the interest. But in any case, the main point is that we need to establish such a mechanism for our southern organizations at the regional level, at the continental level, to cooperate and collaborate, and of course, above all, to also pool resources where necessary. Now, some might say, yes, but there is already some form of coordination. And it is true. Recently, there was the AU, African Union, CARICOM, Caribbean Community Summit. And there might be a CELAC AU summit. Now, that is a step in the right direction, without a doubt. But what I would say is, first, it is not at the scale we are speaking about, because this is a summit that lasted a day, less than a day in fact, and it was a bilateral, AU-CARICOM. It was not CARICOM, AU, ASEAN, Arab League, CELAC, all together coordinating. The second is, of course, and this is a work of, well, there's 2 points. One, we need to work seriously on the political will and that southern identity and that recognition at the governmental level that we share interests that make it necessary for us to collaborate, because, and I must say this, it was a summit and the participation from CARICOM was quite high level, but unfortunately there were not enough heads of state from Africa. And this must be stated. And I say this because when it is the AU-EU or AU-Russia, the participation is excellent. So it is time for our countries to also commit to collaborate together. But the second point, of course, regarding participation, this is why what I am proposing is not only summits between all of our heads of state, which naturally cannot enter into as much detail or as much coordination. It is a summit between the heads of those executive secretariats, in the case of the AU, of the Commission, or in the ASEAN, the head of the Secretary General of the Secretariat, to coordinate how best to support member states and countries in achieving their aspirations. And of course, I propose this, and I think it is becoming urgent. Remember, the worst of all political crimes is being right at the right time, but not acting quick enough on it, and the moment fleeting, disappearing, dissolving away. And I think we are in such a moment. The moment is right. It is urgent. We must act now. But I also must say that we must stop. And I say this, perhaps the OSCE is sometimes guilty of this. I hope we're not. As multilateral organizations, we must stop, especially at the higher level, because, at the level of the technical staff of our organizations, or in the UN system, the professional staff, the collaboration tends to flow quite well. But especially the higher you go up, the bigger the ego gets. And I think it is crucial that we stop those petty divisions and petty institutional rivalries amongst our organizations. Even, I would dare to say that the heads of those organizations within this platform don't need to like each other. It is only recognizing that we serve our member states better by working together. And therefore it is time to put aside those petty rivalries, to understand that we are stronger together. And this is an urgent step. And in this, I will not make the proposal formally to those organizations, because I do believe that it is important that the OSCE does not appear as seeking to meddle in their affairs, which it is not. But I mention it publicly, and should they be interested, I also put at their disposal the OSCE Secretariat in the event that they would wish a secretariat that does not have a regional or continental mandate. Again, African integration is not an OSCE mandate. We stand ready to support it, but it is not ours. Arab integration, similarly, it is the mandate of those respective organizations. But I put the OSCE Secretariat and I put my own offices, good offices as they would say, at their disposal should they wish an entity to facilitate this coordination and to facilitate those meetings. And I say this because now is the time for the greater self to come together at the level of our organizations, at the level of our governments, at the level of our peoples. It is time for the greater self to finally take its place within this historic moment that is a moment of unmaking of the world order, to take its place, play its historic role by being the protagonists of its own future, reshape the international order, achieve development, authentic development for our peoples, but above all, to ensure that humanity in its entirety is giving back its own humanity that has been stripped away. With this, I conclude my general reflections and I open the floor to your questions, to your comments, to your insights. As I wait for the computer. So, what partnership framework? So this is from YouTube, from Meron Berhanu, Z21. What partnership frameworks does the OSCE have in place for private sector organizations or technology firms from the Global South? It hurts me that you still use Global South. I highly recommend Greater South, particularly in Ethiopia. How does the OSCE engage with private sector technology firms in advancing its digital transformation knowledge-sharing initiatives, such as GRESIS or GRESLearn? Well, as I've always said, the private sector has a role to play in this collective endeavor, and especially when we speak of technology and digitalization endeavors. Now, however, and here I am just contextualizing, there is also the challenge that the OSCE is not a government. That is, we can't unilaterally create a public-private partnership in a specific area. And of course, the OSCE, being intergovernmental, is not for profit. So we also cannot be seen as either seeking profit-making endeavors or get the criticism of using public money, money of member states, towards profit-making endeavors. That being said, this is the recognition of the role of the private sector when it comes to technology in particular, and the third way of development. It is also, of course, the context with regards to the guardrails that we must face. This being said, in terms of technology, because yours is very directed towards technology, we have a number of initiatives that go in the direction of involving our private sector, but above all, of creating opportunities for us to become drivers of the technological revolution through the participation of our startups, our entrepreneurs. How so? The first is the Greater South Fair for Endogenous Technologies, GRESFET, which is a fair that happens every 2 years. The first edition happened in 2020, for December 2024, and the next one will be, we hope perhaps a bit earlier, maybe around September or October 2026. And grass-fed is a platform every 2 years to, one, of course, invite some extraordinary thinkers of technology, entrepreneurs that have succeeded in developing technologies within our countries, to share experiences, and so on and so forth. Yada yada, as they would say, because this is what happens at every conference. What is more interesting about grass-fed is the fact of inviting our startups and providing them booths for them to learn from each other, for them to gain visibility at a more international level, at the level of the South, but above all, to build strategic partnerships. And I say to build strategic partnerships because our startup ecosystems inevitably require to grow capital investments, especially pre-seed capital, which is the most difficult to find before you enter, as they say in the jargon, Series A, Series B, and so on, of raising funds. And they also need and the investors, therefore the startups, need secondary markets to be able to trade shares. And what is secondary markets, just to facilitate? A startup is not being traded publicly. You cannot easily sell a share within a startup. But you need the secondary markets in case that you require liquidity as an investor to be able to sell those shares. Anyway, the main point is we need the capital investment and we need the secondary markets, amongst other things, of course. The right policies, the right infrastructure. I'll come to the infrastructure in a moment. Grass-fed seeks to be a platform where the startups on their own, using this platform, can cement those strategic partnerships to gain investment, pre-seed investment, and Series A and so on investments. But you cannot do so, again, if you're not visible enough. And this is why grass-fed is important in terms of our startup ecosystems. But of course, it's a small pebble in a mountain of pebbles. The other aspect is we need the innovation hubs. And in this regard, the OSC is in a dynamic. We plan to establish a number of what we call South-South tech hubs or tech nexuses. And these hubs, the first one, I've mentioned it already, to the government of Nigeria, a member state of the OSC, to establish one in Abuja. But of course, and they expressed interest, but we're in early talks, but we want to establish others. Those hubs, those innovation hubs, can act first as incubators and accelerators of technology at a regional level. Second, most crucially, accelerate South-South technology transfers. And third, also facilitate partnerships and investment opportunities across the 3 continents. And by doing this also, therefore, providing our startups with economies of scale in order for them to grow and not stagnate. But again, this is only a small part of it. It's just one more pebble. There is an additional pebble, which is we need also public investment and the infrastructure that facilitates it in the startup ecosystems. And of course, each country should do so. But I believe, as I've mentioned in the past, that we can establish a Southern Innovation Fund. A Southern Innovation Fund that could be financed in multiple ways. The first, of course, is member state contributions, voluntary contributions. The second is having a small portion of it from private sector companies, but private sector companies not as investment, mind you, but as part of their corporate social responsibility, especially our bigger tech companies that can redirect that corporate social responsibility towards this fund. And third, by coming together as countries of the South to also negotiate collectively a fee, or call it taxation, of the big tech companies, the mamas, the Metas, the Alphabets, the Microsofts, and so on, of the Apples of our world, that make tremendous amounts of revenue in our countries, and yet do not pay a single dollar in taxation. By coming together as countries, we can ensure that there is a fee, be it 2% or 1% even, of the funds that they make in our countries that could be redirected towards this Southern Innovation Fund that can then go and invest in the infrastructure necessary for our startup ecosystems and tech companies, but also in the startups themselves. This is what I would say so far regarding your question. If, of course, you want me to develop, I will be delighted to do so. From WhatsApp, I see María da Consolação. Una sugerencia: incluir subtítulos en español en los videos. Un buen punto. I will answer in Spanish and then I will summarize both the question and the answer. No, es un punto imprescindible, sin duda alguna. Y de hecho nosotros habíamos intentado, ¿no?, de establecer una dinámica de subtítulos no solamente en español, ¿no?, sino también en árabe, en francés, para permitir también un intercambio más inclusivo y más amplio, que sea una reflexión de nuestro gran sur. El problema encontrado, y es el desafío de estar en vivo, es imposible hacerlo de forma detallada, precisa, en vivo, o son plataformas, y aquí hablo con plena sinceridad, o plataformas, desafortunadamente, de código cerrado, de propiedad privada, que tienen costos inaceptables para nosotros. Porque siempre nos recordamos que el presupuesto de la OSS es el presupuesto de los estados, es el presupuesto de los pueblos, y no queremos gastar por gusto. Pero es por eso que he propuesto justamente de hacer que los vivos sean cada 3 a 4 semanas, pero tener conversaciones, charlas con invitados, que ellos sí, porque no será en vivo, podrán tener subtítulos en los varios idiomas. Espero que he contestado. Pero mil disculpas de no haber podido incluir los subtítulos hasta ahora, pero seguimos buscando. Y si usted tiene una sugerencia, de hecho, de una plataforma que se puede usar, una herramienta, será con muchísimo gusto que la escucharemos. So, Maria was saying a suggestion includes Spanish subtitles. And I was saying that it is a very important point, and that in fact, we from the OSC wanted to include subtitles, not just in Spanish, but at the very least in the official languages, Arabic, French, and English also. So when I'm speaking Spanish, it can be in English. But this is the problem, precisely, of being live. Because either you can't do it live with subtitles that are precise and are not gibberish, or what we have found out is there are platforms that can do it, but they are closed source and proprietary, and I speak very frankly, too costly for our taste. And I say too costly for our taste because we don't forget that the OSC is ultimately financed by the countries. That is, our budget is the budget of the countries, the governments, which means it is the budget of the peoples. And we refuse to spend excessively in things that are not directly serving our peoples. But this is why, in part, I am proposing, and I took that decision, of having our lives every 3 to 4 weeks, and having conversations with guests that will be first more interesting than only me engaging, facing a camera, but also that will not be live, and therefore can be subtitled in all of our official languages, but also that the guests may be Spanish speakers, Arab speakers, French speakers, or English speakers. This is what I say, and I apologize again that so far we haven't been able to put any subtitles. However, if any of you has a recommendation regarding a platform or a tool that could be used, we look forward to that suggestion. We have another question from WhatsApp by Jamie. Dear Secretary General, thanks for sharing your views about the changes in live with the SG broadcasts, which are appreciated by the audience. I wish that your efforts to add more voices to these exchanges from across the Greater South will be fruitful. Holding webinars is also a great idea, I believe. In this regard, I would appreciate if you can elaborate on the virtual youth forum, which you announced last week. Regarding the binary of reform and transformation, what is the best way, in your opinion, to ensure the consent and active participation of all stakeholders? Thanks a lot. Two very crucial and substantive questions. Regarding this virtual youth forum that I did announce, although I did say that we would more formally announce it in a couple of weeks, because I like things to be done well, because I often say that good enough is never good enough. But I can elaborate slightly, because for a very long time, I want to be clear, and I had conversations with a number of our youth leaders on this. For a very long time, I resisted the idea of an OSC youth forum, or a space for the youth. And the reason I did that is because there are often, I consider myself still young, so I recall how I felt when they would organize youth summits where we would all attend. And of course, the youth summit was interesting because we met people, but ultimately what would happen is what the true message was, even though symbolically it sought to do the reverse, is you young people speak amongst yourselves and let the big boys speak at the real summit. And therefore my approach had been, with regard to youth, is to involve them directly in the actual summit and give them the same opportunity to speak as others in the real summit. And this is why, for example, one of our associate members is the All Africa Students Union. And I was in fact speaking with their brilliant SG, who's unfortunately finishing his term early next year, I believe. I'm still trying to convince him to do a constitutional amendment. But in any case, but he's too much of a Democrat. But the main point is, with regards to Peter, their SG, I spoke with him about it, and I was saying, look, I want the All Africa Students Union not just to speak in a youth forum. Of course, as a union of students, they have their fora, they have their meeting places. But I want you to speak at our General Assembly. I want you to speak at a summit organized by the OSC, and I want you to speak with an equal voice as the others. And this, for a long time, had been my approach. Now, as they say, the only things that do not change are either dead or worse, stupid. And I hope that I am neither stupid, foolish, too stubborn to see the changes of the world, and I still think that I am somehow alive. So my thinking has evolved on this. I still stand by my initial assessment. I do not want to create a youth summit that will articulate its own recommendations away from where the real conversations are happening. But I do believe that at least at the level of the Secretariat, it would be particularly, and this is where perhaps my thinking has shifted, is aside from the summits and whatnot, to have a forum for our youth, to engage with the Secretariat more directly, to articulate proposals, but also to take forward this initiative beyond the contours of our own and limitations of an institution and institutionality. Because our youth can reach every sector of our societies in areas where perhaps it falls outside of our mandate. And therefore, my idea with regards to the youth forum is to engage principally because, of course, the Greater South is the majority of humanity. It's over 80% of humanity. It is 3 continents. It's very difficult, to create a youth forum that is representative of every single country. But what I plan to do, and this is why we said we'd announce it more formally later down the line, is engaging with our regional student unions, the All Africa Student Union, the OCLAI, for example, in Latin America and the Caribbean, and so on and so forth, for them to both have their executives, that is their SGs, present, but also to recommend from various regions of Africa, various regions of Latin America and the Caribbean, some youth, even on a rotating basis, that could form part of that forum. Then the essence of it will be to articulate the modalities of collaboration, because I don't want it to be a one-time event where I am engaging and saying a few words and then everybody says a few words and that is it. I think it is important to structure that conversation, to hear and structure it so that every young person has the opportunity and the time to contribute effectively their thoughts, their views, to engage with the Secretariat, to disagree with the Secretariat, but above all, I think what is more important, and that's why I called it a forum and not a meeting, is the after. And it's articulating the right collaboration methods amongst those youth that can take forward the conversation. And then it can develop into other initiatives. That is, the main point is, it is crucial for the OSC to hear the views, the proposals, the initiatives being put forward by our youth, and also to put our case to our youth, and to ask for their support in this endeavor. This is what I could say about the Youth Forum for now. More details will follow further down the line. Now, you're also asking, regarding the binary of reform and transformation, how to ensure the consent and active participation of all stakeholders. Now, let me be clear. There is no easy recipe because active participation, in the sense of a democratic participation of all stakeholders in this endeavor of transformation, which we call the third way of development, is ultimately a process, first, of consciousness building. And consciousness building is a profoundly human endeavor. It is not raising a magic wand. It is talking with people, engaging with people, dialing, entering into a dialogue with people. It's sensibilizing people to those issues and hearing their concerns. But how has our approach been at the OSC? I think is a more relevant one. Because why did I start with this? Because I don't believe that there is a universal recipe. So I cannot tell you, for example, in your country, I don't know necessarily, Jamie, where you're from, but wherever you are, that I can give you a checklist of things to do to ensure that consciousness building, to ensure that consent and active participation within transformation. What I can tell you is you must ensure that the process of transformation, or the project, the cause of transformation, is not only co-administered in its results, but co-created in its process, so that all stakeholders have a sense of ownership of this process, and therefore a sense of responsibility and duty to its result and execution. And our approach at the OSC, at least at the level of the Greater South, has been to convene the Congress of the Greater South, or I prefer it in French because the original name was in French, Les Assises du Grand Sud, bringing together various stakeholders from each region. Civil society had one, civil society and intellectuals. We already had 2 consultations. We're going for more in 2026. So civil society, governments, private sector, organizing those consultation meetings across regions, and with the aim that each consultation meeting would reach, through the participation of those stakeholders, a set of recommendations on how to build a third way of development. What is the plan of action to go forward? And these recommendations would be collated by the OSCE Secretariat and eventually presented at the summit of the Greater South, where all stakeholders would be invited to debate and reach consensus on the action plan, on the basis of those regional recommendations. That being said, you might say, yes, but how many people could you possibly invite for it to be representative of all stakeholders? And that is precisely the point. How many people could we possibly invite? And this is why one of the firm belief and convictions that is mine, and that of the OSCE, which is instilled in everything we do, including this process of Congress, is the principle of contextuality. That is, we have to agree at the level of the Greater South to a general framework, but then agree and understand that it needs to be contextualized at the basis of a region. It needs to be contextualized at the basis of a country. It needs to be contextualized at the level of a county, and so on and so forth. And you cannot contextualize on behalf of others. Therefore, you have to embed in the endeavor of transformation first the provisions and the mechanisms for the translation of those universal principles and aims and processes and commitments at various levels of our countries. And that implies a certain degree of decentralization. Without decentralization, to a certain degree, there can be no co-ownership. If there is no co-ownership, there can be no consent for the transformation and no process of transformation. This is what I would say on a very technical basis. If you find the answer as usual, not as usual, no. I was going to say, if you don't find the answer as usual, if you find the answer as usual unsatisfactory, that is what I want to say. It could be misunderstood that my answers are usually unsatisfactory. I hope they're not. So I will rephrase this. As usual, should you find my answer unsatisfactory, please do not hesitate to let me know, and I'll be happy to develop further. Thank you. So I see from Facebook area that says number 1. Thank you. Muchísimas gracias. But number 1 should not be just a person, no? It should be a collective. And here we have a small collective, but above all, we need all of you to be our number 1s. Then I see from Instagram, from Beza Meheret, good to see you. Well, thank you for the message. I can't unfortunately see you back, but the spirit and the aspiration is there. From LinkedIn, Engineer Solomon Kasahun, good. And from X, Twitter, Carlos Rasak, I'm enjoying the talk. I imagine just because you're called Carlos that you must be a Spanish speaker from Latin America. No? Huh? Nigerian. That is okay, you are from Nigeria. Then in that case, Carlos, I forgot how to say thank you. And anyway, it doesn't matter. The main point is that you are embodying, therefore, the spirit of South-South cooperation. You are from Nigeria, you're called Carlos. And that is a good sign rather than a bad one. So thank you very much for enjoying the talk. I hope that we'll also get participation from you. I see that there is one more question that came on YouTube. BFFIA242. Befia. I'll call you Befia. Does the OSCE support non-profit organizations in Caribbean countries that are working to challenge the status quo and increase local ownership and economic empowerment within the blue economy, especially in nations that have historically had limited participation? Additionally, how does the OSCE address issues of environmental justice in this context? That is a crucial, very important question, one I am not sure that I can entirely unpack in 5 or 10 minutes. In fact, as you might know, there is COP coming up in Brazil. We will be there. There will be also a conference, an international conference in Brazil about reparations, which we will also be attending. I believe I was invited as a keynote speaker. And of course, the issues there are very complex and require time to unwrap. But what I would say, on multiple fronts, and I'll take it from the easiest to answer to the most complex. The first, the OSCE always stands ready to work with non-governmental organizations. But you have to understand as well two aspects. Number one, the OSCE is not a grant-making institution. That is, we collaborate with non-governmental organizations, but we do not finance. I know your question was not specifically about finance, but then, of course, we generally have to limit our collaboration with, that has an impact, with non-governmental organizations to those that are within our member states, if there is a project or a program that is to be implemented, or we invite them, even though they're not from a member state, at the more multilateral level. And so, in this regard, what I would say to you, Befia, is that the main issue that we are faced with the Caribbean, of course, is that we only have a single founding member state from the Caribbean, Guyana, from CARICOM. And this has there's multiple reasons for this. The first is that when the founding summit happened, it happened in Djibouti, which, frankly, given the infrastructural challenges of connectivity between our continents, is extremely far from most Caribbean nations, not because it's fine just in terms of geography, it's not that far, but it is extremely far in terms of time of travel, because we don't have good connections between the Caribbean, for instance, and Africa, which had an impact, of course, on participation from Caribbean countries. The second reason that this has occurred is, and I'll speak quite frankly, the co-hosts of the summits, there was some mistake along the way in terms of the delivery of the invitations. So most countries, unfortunately, in the Caribbean and Latin America, in fact, received the invitations as late as the last week of November for a summit happening last week of January. And of course, that has had an impact on participation and commitment to sign such an important treaty as the OSCE Constitutive Charter. And the third, because it has been some time since 2020, is that, as I've said in the past, once the OSCE was created, it was first very difficult to start saying to countries to join, because once you are existing as an institution, it's no longer just an idea and a commitment to the construction. Countries legitimately ask, yes, but what have you achieved so far for me to join? It's a legitimate question. And therefore, the major focus that was mine was building the Secretariat, delivering the common programs, to have and demonstrate results, and to serve our vision, to serve our member states, to serve our peoples. And it is only now, and this is something I've proposed in the common program for 2025-2026, in stanza 7 and stanza 6, which has been approved by our member states. Now is the time, now that the Secretariat is consolidated, now that the programs have been delivered and are being built upon, is to open a new chapter for our family of nations by ensuring that a greater number of our countries of the Greater South take their rightful place amongst our family of nations, amongst this collective of sovereign equals. And in this regard, a particular focus has been given by the General Assembly, that of focusing on the regions that are currently underrepresented in our current state membership. And this means, in part, the Caribbean. And here I do believe that the Caribbean must play a crucial role within our collective endeavor. Because probably more so than some other of our countries, they have a profound understanding, a visceral understanding, because of the arbitrariness sometimes of geography, of the importance of cooperation and collaboration and working through to achieve common objectives than, as I said, most of our countries. And this understanding, this consciousness, is also one that can contribute greatly to our collective of nations, whilst I also believe that the OSCE can support greatly. Remember, our spirit is that of a community of mutual learning, where each country contributes and benefits from the necessary support and solidarity. And I also believe that the experiences in the Caribbean can contribute greatly in terms of the blue economy as one such example. And in this regard, to achieve it, and this is why I took this detour, to achieve it, the General Assembly has authorized the Secretary General to open 2 regional offices and to do so in underrepresented regions. And I would like indeed to have one such office established in Latin America and or the Caribbean, and one in Southeast Asia, because that will bring the Secretariat closer. And that will ensure, because it is very difficult to cooperate with an NGO, for instance, not just countries, but because your question was about NGOs, to cooperate and collaborate with NGOs, work with NGOs. This is, for those that don't know, the Muslim call to prayer. And this shows, as I've said in the past, the South, as it is, diverse, but open, indeed, a regional office there, because it is difficult to cooperate and collaborate as from headquarters in Addis Ababa with an NGO working in a specific country in the Caribbean. Because first we have to know each other, know that we exist, and also have a more contextual approach of collaboration. With those regional offices that will not just be representation offices, but will have technical teams, we can ensure greater cooperation with NGOs in that region. I hope you understand the dynamic. So we are going in that direction, even though today, of course, we don't have as much cooperation as we want. That being said, we are, yes, developing a fruitful collaboration, even though it's not, well, it is an NGO, even though in a more academic sphere, with the Association of Caribbean Universities, whose Secretary General, extraordinary Secretary General, is based in Martinique, I believe. Well, you ask a question about how does the OSCE address issues of environmental justice in this context. As I said, this is one that is slightly more complex. Why? Because it takes time to break down every part of it. Because otherwise, if you don't, you end up sounding like a broken record that is repeating what everybody else is saying. So I will limit myself to the following. Without the shadow of a doubt, the issue of climate change is one that impacts all of humanity, yes, but the majority of the brunt and the damage is being faced by countries of the South, especially countries such as the Caribbean, Pacific Island states, and so on. And yet, our countries have collectively contributed the least to that climate crisis. And in this regard, it is imperative for us as countries to be very clear that there needs to be environmental justice, there needs to be climate justice, and understood in the broadest possible sense. That is 2 layers. That is justice for the planet, but also justice for our peoples, by having the people who caused this crisis in the first place take up their responsibility and finance the transition that we need. Now, as you know, many commitments have been made, the Loss and Damage Fund and so on, but our partners have rarely followed through. So in this regard, we do believe from the OSCE that there's multiple things that must be done. First, we need greater cooperation amongst our countries to create the leverage necessary to ensure that our partners in the North fulfill their commitments. That it requires leverage. And yes, the Group of 77 in China is a crucial group. But again, it is a very broad coalition with little to no capacity to execute actions. Hence the need for greater coordination. But of course, I do not believe that it is possible, because I think this issue should not be limited to the member states of the OSC, so the OSC cannot play that role immediately unless all countries of the Greater South, as they should, take their rightful and legitimate place and seat amongst our family of nations. And it is difficult to say we will create only a new secretariat, a new organization for that coordination specifically. Here, because when you go at COP, the majority of the real conversations are happening amongst the African group, amongst the Arab group, and so on. And the G77 meeting is broad, very short meetings that occur. And in this regard, and it goes back to what I was saying earlier, we need greater coordination and collaboration amongst our regional organizations. Because they each have secretariats. They each organize common positions. Recently, a few weeks ago, it was the Africa Climate Summit here in Addis Ababa. And therefore, creating that interoperability, that structure that I was saying about greater coordination amongst our regional organizations can go a long way in ensuring environmental justice and reparations, not only in the sense of the historical injustices, but also in terms of the economic and environmental damage that are being suffered today out of no fault of our own. But this is only a small part of the equation, because the other part of it is, as I've said before, we cannot find ourselves only in the position of victims, even though we tend to find ourselves quite complacently content with that status, because it removes the responsibility of success and failure. And in this regard, I do believe it is crucial that we take up our responsibilities. And in this regard, I've said in this regard quite a bit. This is another piece of advice I got. I tend to use, depending on my mood, some words as I'm thinking. So I will no longer say, in this regard. You see, I do follow advice sometimes. The main point that I am trying to convey is we need to create our own institutional financing mechanisms to address the climate crisis, but not just from first, our own institutions. So the OSC today is working toward creating the Greater South Development Bank. Because, as I've said before, there is no lack of capital in the South. There is plenty of capital, it is just misdirected. It needs strategic orientation. But the third of those, the third part of the equation, that to answer your question, again, at a very superficial level, but maybe one day we'll do a more proper sit down where we focus on this topic in particular, and we could even invite Getahun, our head of Climate Action and Resilience Enhancement Office. But the third is we need to shift our mentality when it comes to this. And I say shift our mentalities, shift because I don't want to use paradigm. It's a word that has been so overused that it doesn't mean anything anymore. A paradigm shift, which sounds potent when you realize that if we follow, I'm sure that if somebody does a study of how many times paradigm shift has been used, that now is the time, because it's always this, right? If you focused on the conferences, now is the time for the paradigm shift. And may we move from speeches to action. And if you listen to this, you would believe that at least just in the last 10 years, there have been maybe 2,000 paradigm shifts that should have happened at that particular time. So I will not say paradigm shift. What we do need is a transition of mentalities, a change of mentalities. And that is to not just understand climate action. And this is why I do like your focus or your mention of the blue economy. not just in terms of limiting damage, not just in terms of restoring and regenerating, but also ecological action as a source of development that creates prosperity, creates employment, and also ensures sustainability. And this goes, and this is why it's justice and it's not charity. This goes, and again, I can't speak specifically to the Caribbean, but more generally, I've given this example before, I have no problem repeating it now. It is saying, there is no energy transition, no environmentally sustainable transition to a more environmentally sustainable world without critical minerals that are necessary for solar panels, etc. Right? Now, those critical minerals, in their majority, not exclusively, are found in the soils of our countries. And yet, our countries export those critical minerals and import, with great difficulty, because it is more costly, the solar panels, etc. And in this regard, by coming together as countries, we can say no more exportation of raw materials towards the north to sell it back to us as solar panels. You have to invest in the construction of solar panels here. And then we can send some raw critical minerals to you to develop your own solar panels. Now, this is, to me, a measure of justice. But crucially, it is also environmentally more sensible. I read a study some years ago, which was a slightly different dynamic, but you will see that it's equally applicable. That was that in order to buy cheaper solar panels, some countries, I think it was in France, started importing panels from China. Very well. Now, as you know, we do not yet know how to produce solar panels and other renewable technologies sustainably. That is, we do not know how to build a solar panel using clean renewable energy. There is still CO2 emission in the construction. Now, they took a study about the traveling of those critical minerals to China, then the cost, because that also has a climate cost, it has carbon emissions. Then, of course, the cost of producing. When I say the cost, I am always speaking in this context about carbon emissions. The carbon emissions of producing the solar panel, and then the cost, the carbon emissions of sending that solar panel to France. Now, mind you, France or some country in Europe, I can't recall. Now, solar panels, I mean, it depends on which solar panel and the study that you read, but it has between 5, 6, maybe if you push it, 8, and I'll even be generous, 10 years of useful life. That is, you can use it for that period before you need to change it. But with all those, when you accumulate all those emissions, you would need 33 years for the use of that solar panel to compensate the carbon emissions of its production. That is, it is self-defeating. Now, I am not saying this about all solar panels. I'm saying about this modality of production of solar panels. So when we are saying we no longer want you to just buy from us critical minerals and send back solar panels, we are saying it for justice. We want to create jobs for our people. We want high value added industrialization. But we're also saying it for the environment. Because by sending you the critical minerals, you're producing it and sending it back to me, we are multiplying the carbon emissions. Whereas if you invest here in our country to produce the solar panels in our country, then you only need to send it once and not twice. I don't know if I'm making sense. So I'm really moving towards ecologically driven development as a measure of justice. This is what I would say about this, but perhaps one day we can have a longer session. I hope it is a matter that I have adequately addressed. Beautiful. So, do we have any other question? No? Well, in this regard, and in order, out of respect, not to continue talking over the prayer that is being broadcast from the nearby mosque, I would like to bring this session to a close. I hope that the new format of the Third Way Live with ESG that I'm proposing, and the Third Way conversations with ESG, will be fruitful. But of course, as you know, the road is made by walking. If further down the line we realize that it is not adequate, this format was more adequate, we'll happily come back to it. In the meantime, I invite you all to remember that the third way of development does not belong to the OSC, it does not belong to Manssour Bin Mussallam. It is a collective cause that belongs ultimately, first and foremost, to our peoples, to each one of you, to every stakeholder. And this requires your proactive participation in the endeavor. And to this end, I beseech you to stand up, contribute your strength, contribute your conviction, and walk with us. Send us your proposals. And beyond your proposals, with the collaboration of the OSC, push this forward. Push this vision of a transformed world, an authentic development from the Greater South, by the Greater South, for humanity, in your communities, in your countries. Because only then will it be possible to achieve what was once thought to be impossible. To quote Benedetti, that is, that the entirety of the world knows that the South also exists. Thank you.